Over time, suspicions there'd been foul play on KI, where Slater and Osborne died, were fanned by casual comments about the hot-headed Irishman, and that the trekkers had disagreed about the course they should take. Two of the surviving trekkers, Nantes and Fisher, were overheard quarrelling. Nantes said,
"If you say much, I will out what was done on the island."
To which Fisher replied,
"You cannot do that without breaking your oath."
So what really happened on KI?
G'day, I'm Peter.
And g'day, I'm Greg.
Welcome to Today's Stories from Our Past, a podcast about a history of Australia from about 1800 onwards. The story is told through the experiences of those who lived it.
It will tell you stories about Australia that you probably haven't heard before.
This is the 6th episode in a season we've called Bound for South Australia. If you haven't listened to this season from episode 1, we'd suggest that you stop listening now and go back to the beginning. So in the last episode, we discussed the voyage of the Africaine, which brought the Colonial Secretary, Robert Gouger, and his clerk, Charles Nantes, to South Australia. Importantly, we covered the tragic trek across KI, where two young men, Slater and Osborne, died, and my ancestor, Charles Nantes, almost joined them. In this episode, we'll look at what was happening elsewhere and the consequences and accusations that followed the tragic trek.
So what was happening on the Africaine while the group was trekking across KI?
On 2 November 1836, that's just the day after the trekkers were dropped off on KI, the Africaine sailed into Nepean Bay. On that day, Robert Gouger wrote in his diary,
"About 11 o'clock, Nepean Bay opened to us, and all eyes were directed to the shore in the expectation of seeing our fellow colonists. At length, we observed 3 vessels at anchor in the bay, upon which signals were hoisted and the guns fired. These were answered from the ships and the shore, and presently a boat put off, which, in due time, brought to us Mr. Samuel Stevens, the company's colonial manager. Before deciding where to take up our temporary residence until the arrival of the governor, Brown and I thought it expedient to see Colonel Light, who was then surveying at Cape Jervis. We accordingly sent for Captain Lipson, the harbour master, who, we understood, was in the colonel's confidence, and in the evening he rode from the Signet to us. From him we learned that a most enchanting country had been discovered at Cape Jervis, with which Colonel Light was so much pleased as to be almost fixed in its favour, but that its superior advantages to Kangaroo Island were not the only cause of the removal of the depot from the island."
The officials on the Africaine asked the locals had they seen the trekkers. Gouger and co were shocked to hear that, in the locals' opinion, the probability of the trekkers reaching the settlement unaided was very low. A worried Gouger wrote in his diary,
"The opinion which the sealers give of the pedestrian party succeeding in reaching the settlement are very discouraging, nay, fearful. All agree in saying it is impossible, but that they should be lost in the woods, and unless very fortunate in finding water, would be starved to death. Search parties were at once organized under the immediate supervision of Mr. Samuel Stevens, Dr. Wright, and Mr. Hallett, and dispatched in various directions. As these parties consisted of islanders well acquainted with the country, accompanied by their native women, great hopes were entertained of their ultimate success in finding the unfortunate wanderers."
Well, the locals knew something about KI, that it is not an open grassy plain. It seems like Osborne and Slater were doomed.
Yeah. Parties, including some of the First Nations women living with the sealers, were sent out in search of Slater and Osborne. They said they found tracks, but of one person only. No bodies, alive or dead, were found.
Well, if those parties were sent out soon after the arrival of the Africaine, they couldn't have found the trekkers. Those men would have been struggling through the scrub near the southern coast of KI.
Yes, but nobody knew where they were. After a few days, the Africaine had to move to the mainland, where Colonel Light was exploring. This was on day 6 of the trek. On that day, Mary wrote in her diary.
November 6. This afternoon we set sail for the mainland, which we reached about 4 o'clock. We anchored in Rapid Bay in front of the most beautiful prospect imaginable. But my greatest regret was in leaving Kangaroo Island before we had heard something respecting the young men, for whom we now began to be seriously alarmed, especially as we had ourselves made a slight experiment of the difficulties in travelling in the bush, which sufficiently convinced us that our fears were not without reason.
By now, Mary knew about the difficulties of travelling in the bush, as she described it. She recorded a description of a brief walk that she and her husband took while on KI.
We had spent all day on Kangaroo Island, and during a walk, which I took with my husband, we entered the scrub, as it is called, and incautiously proceeded till we were so completely bewildered that we began to be uneasy, lest we should not find our way out of the labyrinth, which seemed on all sides to be interminable, for nothing could be seen but the sky above us and the bushes around us. Nor could we tell which way to retrace our steps, as no path which we had passed through was discernible. At length, however, after advancing as far as we could judge, about half a mile, we fortunately caught, through a small opening in the brushwood, a glimpse of the sea, and immediately made towards it, following our way through the bushes, down a steep hill till we reached the shore. But for this providential escape, our adventure possibly might have terminated as fatally for us as for the young men who attempted to accomplish the rash undertaking of traversing what was, at least to them, an unknown country. For at that time it was uninhabited even by natives, except a very few who resided with 1 or 2 white men who had been on the island for some years. According to report, this was the general character of the island, and a passage through was extremely difficult, even to those accustomed to such travelling, and doubly so to inexperienced young men.
Yeah, well, Mary got that right. She was reluctant to leave KI without finding them, but must have had a good reason for moving across to Rapid Bay, and that's where Colonel Light was then exploring.
Yep. Captain Duff had to move on. Apart from the immigrants really wanting to get to their final destination, the Africaine needed to unload and then go to Van Diemen's Land to get livestock and other fresh supplies. He couldn't wait indefinitely at KI. So, on 7 November, the Africaine left Nepean Bay and went to Rapid Bay, where Colonel Light was working. Soon after, they moved up to Holdfast Bay. That's modern-day Glenelg. A few days later, Mary Thomas wrote in her diary.
November 20. This day the Africaine sailed for Van Diemen's Land. The Signet and Rapid had also departed, so that we were left without any protection either by sea or land. This, we thought, was not right, especially as the Africaine was bound to remain a month after she'd cast anchor. Consequently, she ought to have been stationary till December 2. Moreover, we had heard nothing of the unfortunate young men who were still on Kangaroo Island, and for whose ultimate fate we were now seriously apprehensive. We were still hoping that the peculiar capacity of the black women for tracing in the bush would enable the search party to discover the wanderers, though probably in an exhausted state. This was a sorrowful beginning and greatly damped our spirits, but we could not give them up for lost.
Mary was really upset about the missing trekkers. Of course, we should remember that Osborne was an apprentice to her husband, and the Thomas family were responsible for bringing Osborne out to South Australia.
Yeah. However, life goes on. Many of the immigrants had now moved from KI to Holdfast Bay and were starting to get settled. building tents and huts and getting used to their new environment.
Yeah, but what are the missing trekkers?
On 11 December, Gouger made a diary entry. This is now more than a month since the Africaine left Nepean Bay without knowing the fate of the trekkers. He wrote,
Prayers were read today in Mr. Kingston's tent by Mr. Gilbert, and a sermon was to have been read also, but information arrived that a large ship was sailing into the bay, and the anxiety was so great that the larger part of the congregation separated and went to the beach, expecting it might be the governor. It proved, however, to be the Emma from Kangaroo Island, bringing the company's livestock, etc. I returned to my dinner, and we had hardly finished when two gentlemen made their appearance. They proved to be the captain of the Emma and Captain Nelson of the John Pirrie, who brought us letters from England. Our first inquiry was of the fate of the 6 poor fellows who, it will be remembered, landed on the western shore of Kangaroo Island, intending to walk across it by Captain Sutherland's track. Of these, only 4 have been found: Mr. Nantes, a clerk in the office of the Colonial Secretary, and 3 labourers. Mr. Slater, a surgeon, and Mr. Osborne, printer, are, it is feared, lost. Mr. Nantes states that after being out 9 days, Osborne was unable to proceed, and that Slater, with his characteristic generosity, said he would stay with him while the rest of the party pushed on in the hope of sending relief to the 2 left behind. 2 days after this, Nantes and his party were found by a fishing boat and were conveyed to the settlement, not having tasted food for 4 days, but are now recovering and are in tolerably good health. Parties sent in search of Slater and Osborne say that they have the tracks of but one person, and as he appears to walk in circles or backwards and forwards, they fear he is out of his mind. This doubtless was Slater. Osborne most probably has perished. Search parties were, however, still out when the Emma left, though no hope remains of finding either alive. Thus, to Captain Sutherland's very erroneous account of the interior of the island, it is to be feared 2 gallant and educated young men have fallen victims.
So Gouger finally admitting that the sales prospectus that he used in pre-selling land in South Australia was wrong. I wonder if he felt guilty about the probable deaths of Slater and Osborne.
As far as I can tell, Gouger never expresses any guilt or concern about his role in the fake Sutherland report and the subsequent deaths of Slater and Osborne. On the same day, Mary Thomas wrote a long entry in her diary.
December 11. This day about noon, a report prevailed that a ship was in sight and that it might be the Tam O'Shanter, the arrival of which we were anxiously awaiting. We sent the boys to the beach to inquire, and they soon returned with the news that the Emma, a vessel that came out before the Africaine, in the service of the South Australian Company, I believe, had returned from Kangaroo Island, whither she had been sent with stores, and that she had on board 2 of the young men who had been so long wandering on the island, Nantes and Fisher, our printer. This proved to be true, but the latter did not come on shore that day. 4 of them at length returned, with vague and rather contradictory statements that they had left Slater and Osborne near a lagoon, unable to proceed any further, but that they would do so as soon as they had somewhat recovered from their fatigue, that they had plenty of provisions with them, thus keeping up our hopes of their final safety. They never returned, however, nor could we learn anything with certainty as to their fate, though we made constant inquiry and questioned everyone in the least likely to afford information. Ultimately, we gave up all hope, and it became evident that they had come to some unhappy end. Whatever it may have been, a mystery hangs over it to this day. This melancholy affair distressed us all very much, and it was some time before we could settle to our ordinary avocations. Several persons came from Kangaroo Island at different times, all of whom were more or less acquainted with the circumstances, and most of them expressed their belief that the missing men would eventually return, though they had no doubt that they had been lost in the bush and might not find their way out for a long time. From some casual words spoken by those who returned, I began to suspect that some disagreement had occurred while they were on the island, especially as allusions were made to that hot-headed Irishman. Mr. Slater was, as far as I could observe, a kind-hearted man of gentlemanly manners, and generally on good terms with his fellow passengers. But sometimes he showed unmistakable proofs of a fiery temperament, which on one occasion caused me some uneasiness.
She then recounts the story of Slater brandishing a pistol during the voyage and Osborne calming him down. Mary continues.
Whether anything of the kind had occurred or not during their route across Kangaroo Island, I cannot tell. But that some dispute did arise, I have reason to believe from hints which were occasionally thrown out by those who returned, and by which it appeared that they could not agree as to the course they should pursue, some of the party wishing to go one way and the rest another. How it was settled, of course, I had no means of ascertaining, except that Osborne, as usual, adhered to his friend, and they parted company with the rest. All my endeavours to obtain a satisfactory explanation for their absence failed, and though I repeatedly questioned all those who returned, and Fisher in particular, I could get no other answer than that they were on their way and would soon arrive. As I said before, we never saw them again, and when all hope was gone, the painful task devolved on me to convey the melancholy tidings to Osborne's father. As the best means of doing so, I wrote to our agent in London, Mr. Leonard Bow, and gave him a full account, as far as I was able, of the whole affair, requesting him to go to Mr. Osborne and break the sad news to him by degrees, and likewise to get it published in the Spectator, lest the people of England should think that the two unfortunate young men had been murdered by natives. There were none on Kangaroo Island at that time, except a few women, and they were employed by the white residents.
Just a reminder here, Mary's husband, Robert Thomas, had employed both Fisher and Osborne as printers, who were to work for Robert when they reached the new colony.
Yeah, Mary still seems a bit upset. It's interesting that she wants people in England to know that Slater and Osborne weren't killed by the natives.
Yeah, that is an interesting comment. Presumably, she doesn't want people in England to think that it would be dangerous for them to come out to South Australia. Furthermore, she is obviously suspicious of the accounts of what happened.
So what was the aftermath of the deaths?
Obviously, everybody was really keen to know what happened. But Mary Thomas says that Nantes and Fisher were very evasive, and everything they said was completely unsatisfactory, as if they were hiding something. As the months rolled on, the suspicions entertained by Mary Thomas that there had been some foul play were fanned by casual allusions made to the hot-headed Irishman, and by sundry hints dropped from time to time that there had been disagreements amongst the party as to the course they should take. Mary's son-in-law, J.M. Skipper, who was also on the Africaine, reported that he once overheard Nantes and Fisher quarrelling, when the former, he believed it was, said,
If you say much, I will out what was done on the island.
To which Fisher replied,
You cannot do that without breaking your oath.
Now, this seems to create a bit of a conspiracy theory happening here. This overhead conversation seems to imply that something untoward happened on the island. I can't begin to speculate what that might have been.
Yeah, you could come up with any number of explanations, some of them quite innocent, and perhaps try to spare people from awful facts.
Awful facts. I mean, who knows what happened? At the time they leave Slater and Osborne, they've been without water and food for a number of days. They do have weapons with them. You know, perhaps somebody becomes deranged, let's say, shoots somebody else. Who knows?
Truly an unsolved mystery.
Yeah, anyhow, a couple of weeks later, by Christmas Day, more than 200 people were camped near the shore at Glenelg, living in tents and hastily erected huts, while they waited for light to determine a suitable location for the main town. In fact, in Light's mind, he already knew where he wanted to place the town. Amongst the group, of course, was Gouger. He was there with his heavily pregnant wife, Harriet. Then Gouger wrote,
December 28th. This morning, on going as usual to let out my goats, I saw 2 large vessels entering the bay, which proved to be the Buffalo, bringing the governor and other officers, and the Signet from Port Lincoln. Before 8 o'clock, a messenger arrived at my tent requiring my attendance on board. I found His Excellency and all the party in good health and spirits and full of hope and ardour to commence their colonial career.
We'll discuss the rest of that day, known as Proclamation Day, in our next episode.
Okay, but what was the wash-up of the trek?
There were repercussions. Let's chat about Robert Gouger's role in all of this. From the previous episode, I should remind you about a comment in Mary Thomas's diary on the day on which the trekkers went ashore on 1 November. She said,
And at last we discovered the boat approaching the vessel with all those safe who meant to return, and one of the adventurers whose heart failed him when they reached the unknown shore.
So, in addition to the 6 trekkers, there was another person who initially wanted to walk across the island but lost his nerve.
Who was this person?
It was Robert Gouger. The account of the trek, as described by one of the trekkers, Robert Fisher, was published in a newspaper on 8 July 1837. That's about 7 months after the trek started. Apparently, this was done to quell some of the speculation swirling around the affair. We used that account in our previous episode to describe the trek. The publication of Fisher's account of the trek annoyed Gouger. Just 4 days later, Gouger wrote to the newspaper, and his letter was published there. Fisher had criticised Captain Duff for not staying longer at Nepean Bay in order to ascertain what had become of the exploring party. Gouger defended Captain Duff's action and hinted that these 2 young men went ashore against Captain Duff's advice. Gouger said Duff was very reluctant to allow them to land, and that they went on the expedition entirely for their own gratification.
Hang on though, Gouger's diary says that their wish being communicated to Captain Duff, he at once gave his consent, and a boat was lowered to convey them to the shore.
Yeah. Gouger is changing his story from what he actually wrote in his diary on the day. Fisher is now really annoyed. This is his response to Gouger's letter. It was published on 1 September 1837. This is now 9 months after the trek.
Sir, I am reluctantly compelled to notice the letter in your last number, pretending to be explanatory of Captain Duff's proceedings at Kangaroo Island, signed Robert Gouger. Why Mr. Gouger should take upon himself to defend Captain Duff, I know not. I suppose Mr. Gouger had reasons for not daring to refuse Captain Duff's orders. My brother wanderers were unaware, as well as myself, of the dangers and difficulties we had to encounter, and I unhesitatingly assert that Captain Duff had no right whatever to have allowed us to land, much less to have treated us with the cool inhumanity he did after our safe arrival. Nor ought Mr. Robert Gouger to have been the first to urge such a mad-headed project and the first to decline going. Such was the fact. What does Mr. Gouger mean by saying, "We did it for our own gratification and contrary to the advice of Captain Duff, who with great reluctance acceded to our wish to land"? Did not Mr. Gouger particularly wish Mr. Osborne to go and obtain a promise from him that he would, while his real friends advised him to the contrary? And thus one life was sacrificed. And did not Mr. Gouger himself urge us to the expedition because he wished some information about the soil of the island? If Captain Duff was at all reluctant, he would not have ordered 2 days' provisions, 6 bottles of rum and a little brandy to be got ready, and allowed us the use of a boat, and desired the chief mate to go with us to see that we were safely landed. It is too bad that Mr. Gouger, who himself planned the journey and was the readiest to shirk the danger it presented, should now come forward to slander those who had the courage which he wanted. I have no scruple in declaring that I attribute the loss of Dr. Slater and Mr. Osborne and all the sufferings the survivors endured to their following Mr. Gouger's own scheme, for which, had it been successful, he probably would have claimed the credit, as he did, of writing letters from Sydney to his grandmother, but of which he was the copyist only, the author being Mr. Wakefield. By a rather singular coincidence, it happens that I know this fact, having printed these letters and therefore had more to do with their composition than their title page author. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, Robert Fisher.
Wow, Fisher's really irritated with Gouger, who seems to be distancing himself from the whole affair. I wonder what Charles Nantes thought of his boss trying to avoid blame for almost causing Charles's death.
I don't know what Charles thought, and there was no response from Robert Gouger.
So Robert Gouger was the one who lost his nerve and didn't go on the trek. But why would he want it to go in the first place?
Well, if I was of a suspicious mind, I might think that Gouger wanted to see for himself how true Captain Sutherland's report was. Perhaps he already knew or suspected that the report was fake news, to use the modern term. Indeed, he wrote in his diary, thus, to Captain Sutherland's very erroneous account of the interior of the island, it is to be feared 2 gallant and educated young men have fallen victims. I don't think we'll ever know. What we do know is that Slater and Osborne died, and my great-great-grandfather almost died as a result of Captain Sutherland's report and Gouger's proposal that they trek across the island.
Yeah, Gouger's culpable. Just one thing, was Slater and Osborne ever found?
Over the following decades, a few skeletons were found in the bush on KI. But after some investigation, it became clear that none of them could have been Slater and Osborne.
So the long and the short of it is that they were never found, and their final fate could never be determined.
That's about it. And it seems that the truth of the story depends on who's telling it and when. Gouger's account was disputed by Fisher, and Mary Thomas never seemed to really believe Fisher and Nantes.
Yeah, true. We'll never really know.
Now, it might seem like the story of the trek across KI is finalised, but not so. Just to add more confusion, I'll leave the last word to my great-great-grandfather Charles Nantes. In 1866, the discovery of another skeleton found in the bush on KI appeared in the papers. By this time, Charles was a businessman living in Geelong. He wrote to the Geelong Advertiser. This is his version of the trek. Remember that Charles wrote this 30 years after the trek. He wrote,
Sir, I have observed a paragraph copied from the Adelaide papers referring to the remains of a man lately found in Kangaroo Island, with gun, shot belt, etc., and supposed to be one of a party lost from the Africaine in 1836. If this supposition be a correct one, for the paragraph did not state the locality or the precise spot on the island in which these remains were found, they would be those either of Mr. Slater, surgeon, and hailing, I believe, from Dublin, Ireland, or Mr. Osborne, a gentleman connected with the press, an East Indian half-caste. I am now speaking of what occurred 30 years ago and cannot therefore be very accurate in minor particulars. The Africaine, a barque, with a number of government officials on board, the first instalment of the civil government of South Australia, made Kangaroo Island on the southwest side, and lying becalmed, it was determined to make up a party to traverse the island and meet the vessel at a settlement, now Kingscote, presumed to be made by a previous arrival of surveyors, etc.
Okay, Charles's story seems fairly similar to what we have discussed so far.
Yeah, his letter to the paper is fairly long. He describes their hard slog through the scrub and their lack of food and water. This is fairly consistent with the Fisher version. Then, in a later section, Charles wrote,
We had, on the 6th day, that is 3 of the party, been partially supporting Mr. Osborne, who had become very weak, and on rising a hill about midday we saw below us a large lagoon or small lake. The sight of this seemed to infuse fresh strength to our bodies, and Osborne, who could not walk before, now stepped out without assistance. On arriving at the bottom of the hill, a rush was made to the water, but at the first step the woeful misery, dismay and hopelessness which spread over each man's countenance none can understand or conceive, but those placed in similar misery and danger, on finding the water even salter than the salt of the sea. This disappointment was the climax for my 2 friends, Slater and Osborne. They lay down, said they could go no farther, and must die there. For 2 hours did we sit there, discussing in our weak state what was to be done, our tongues and lips black from extreme parchness, our limbs trembling from thorough weakness, barefoot and almost without clothes, torn to pieces by the scrub. I, having the nominal command of the party, seeing that our only safety was in pushing on while we had the power, made a distribution of what we had, leaving Mr. Slater my gun, shot belt, etc. with materials for striking a light. I'm not sure that lucifers or matches were in existence then, and called on those who were able and willing to follow.
Now I have to comment here. Charles is claiming that he was the nominal leader of the group. I find this hard to believe. He was the youngest of the group, and no one else suggests that Charles was in charge. We'll eventually find out, in much later episodes, that Charles had an inflated opinion of his own importance. I am sure that this is what's happening here. Anyhow, he continues his story.
Only 2 responded, but after proceeding about 300 or 400 yards, one of the 3 left behind, a gentleman also connected with the press, but whose name I cannot at present recall, plucked up sufficient courage to follow me after directing the other 2 to go on to a hill in view. I waited for him. He thus saved his life.
The gentleman connected to the press is Fisher. Charles is now claiming that he saved Fisher's life?
That doesn't seem to tally with what we have heard before.
No. Nevertheless, Charles continues his story. While there are a few differences in detail, he describes how they left Slater and Osborne behind and eventually made it to Nepean Bay. Charles doesn't mention that he was left behind on the beach. Anyhow, this is his closing paragraph.
I might remark that it was thought somewhat singular by us that the 4 who kept up best and were finally saved were those who smoked, and we considered that the effect of smoking in raising the saliva to the mouth relieved in some measure the great thirst which tormented us. I am afraid, made this too long for your columns, but the recollections of my first exploration and the probable interest taken in the reminiscences of the trials of the early settlers by the present generation will plead my apology. April 11th, 1866, Charles Nantes.
Yeah, okay, I give up. Charles is now the leader of the expedition and he is not left to die on the beach. Clearly the complete truth of the Africaine trek will never be known.
It will never be known, but it is good to know that smoking is good for your health.
Sure. So, what's your take from all of this?
Charles Nantes survives, which is just as well, as he was my great-great-grandfather, and I wouldn't exist if he wasn't found in time. But all this confirms in my mind that Sutherland's report was fake news, and the use of this report as a marketing tool by Gouger was the direct cause of the deaths of Slater and Osborne. In a later episode, we'll talk about what happened on the day that Governor Hindmarsh arrived, and the following few years of growth in the colony.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for listening.
So it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.